So well done. Thank you very much for coming. I'm very flattered, actually, that you should come at all. When I saw I was up against Gus this morning, I thought, oh, blimey, you know, that's going to be interesting. So I'm really pleased you've come. And I just want to talk to you about the National Trust and change. But before I start, is anyone a member of the National Trust? Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Well, I might ask you to come and join me and give this speech as well. Actually, I might seriously ask whether anyone's noticed any of what I've been doing, which would be really interesting. And I imagine you're all civil servants from central government departments or some regionally based? Anyone, any regionally based? All London? No, not all London. Okay, that's great. So around the country anyway. But no, well, it's great to see you. I'm Fiona Reynolds. I'm Director General of the National Trust, which is a very august title. And I've been at the Trust now for coming up to 9 years. So I was going to just talk to you about the changes that I've been taking the organisation through. And also, I don't know whether anything will emerge, but I'd really like to have a conversation with you afterwards. Any questions, but also any thoughts. There may or may not be analogies with the civil service. And because I went straight to this job from the civil service, I have a very small amount of central Whitehall experience, which I'll mention as I go. And it did strike me that there were at least some things that were similar in terms of the challenges that Whitehall departments face at any time, not necessarily right now, but that sort of constant sense of change and innovation and thinking about the future. Just a tiny bit first about my own career, though, because I am a voluntary sector person pretty much through and through, and I love the voluntary sector. I am a graduate in geography and land economy, which does help if you're interested in environmental and rural things. And I got my very, very first job, which was a chief executive job, which sounds very, very grand. The numbers of staff in this organisation were 1.5, so I have to say it wasn't very grand. But it was a fantastic little charity, which still exists, called the Council for National Parks. And it's now the Campaign for National Parks. And any of you who have anything to do with DEFRA may have come across it. But it had literally just been spun off from an old thing called the Standing Committee on National Parks, which had campaigned for national parks legislation in this country. So it was kind of going independent. And they appointed their first secretary in 1980, which was me. I was very proud. I had one typewriter, no IT or anything, one typewriter, an office with an incredibly sloping floor at the top end of Eaton Square. And I practically lived in the Houses of Parliament because it was at the same time as the Wildlife and Countryside Bill, which some of you may remember was going through. The first time the kind of environmental issues really became big headline news. It was a very significant moment in policy development. And I absolutely had a ball. It was the most amazing job. You know, 1 minute I was talking to people like Dennis Howell, you know, who was Minister for Droughts, remember those days? And, you know, just extraordinary access to senior ministers, senior civil servants, when I was literally about 21. And then I went from there, not a big move geographically, to CPRE, which again some of you may have heard of, now the Campaign to Protect Rural England. I was there for a long, long time, and I was director of the CPRE from my very early 30s. So again, I was a chief executive of a much bigger organisation, 50 staff this time, so still small in kind of Whitehall terms, but 50 staff. And again, absolutely fantastic. CPRE is one of those organisations that was able to sort of punch above its weight. It was tiny by comparison, but it was clever. It was quite skilled at finding the kind of holes through which you could pierce a bit of lobbying, quite good at winning support both in Parliament but also among the civil service. And I became increasingly fascinated by the civil service. Now, you may find that an odd thing to say, but actually I was absolutely fascinated because I ended up being on lots of government committees and reviews of this, that and the other. This is back in the 80s, 90s, and I just got intrigued by how Whitehall worked and what was the way that policy developed. And because I was working increasingly on the early days of sustainable development and thinking about cross-departmental work, I just thought, you know, this would be so interesting. So when in 1998, the Labour government, 1997, the Labour government came in and started advertising senior civil service posts, I did what most of my friends and family thought was completely bonkers and applied for one. And I got it, which was even more of a surprise to everybody, actually, not least me. And it was director of the women's unit. And it was then in DSS, but very quickly moved to the Cabinet Office. And I was there from the summer of '98 for 2.5 years. And many of you, I don't know how many of you work in the Cabinet Office or cross-cutting units of any kind. I'm sure all of you work with cross-cutting issues in various ways. But it was an absolute revelation to me. There I had been in the voluntary sector, happily sort of skipping about, being very clever and enjoying, you know, the opportunity to lobby. And all of a sudden, being inside this enormous and complex machine and actually realizing how complex it is to get other departments to buy into agendas, particularly the women's agenda, which at that time was, you know, there were lots of sort of cynics around. And lots of people saying, oh, this is political correctness gone mad, and all the rest of it. It was a very, very interesting time. And if any of you were around at that time, you know, I'd love to know your perspectives. I think we did some really, really good work. We had some very, very good research we commissioned, particularly on women's incomes. And we did actually get a very interesting new debate going on about the role of women in the economy, in society, and a kind of new perspectives, which I don't know how well that work has survived in literal terms, but I do feel proud of what we did. And I do feel that that experience for me was absolutely fundamental to my ability to do any job in future. Suddenly going from a small organisation where really you could put your arms around it, you could talk to every member of staff individually, you know, to dealing with this enormous bureaucracy and with ministers, which was a new experience and a very interesting one, and with a whole kind of sense of complex cross-cutting government. So I learned an enormous amount during that time. And I have to say, though, I was kind of on the brink of thinking, well, do I go for something else within government? You know, Cabinet Office was a very interesting place at that time. Not all good, but some very interesting units, some very interesting policies being developed, or, you know, or what. And then Director General of the National Trust was advertised. And I thought, you know, I've got to go for that job. Now, it might sound incredibly arrogant to even think of it, because the National Trust, you know, one of these incredibly august organisations, how could I, you know, at the age then, I think I was just over 40, how could I think of being its Director General? Well, the only reason I could even think of it was because all the time I was at CNP and at CPRE, I had been successively the youngest person on a National Trust Regional Committee, and then I'd been elected to the National Trust Council. So I did actually know, not as a staff member, but I did actually know quite a lot of people and know some of how it worked. And I'd been a member of the National Trust since I was at university, and was just, and it's just, you know, knew it was a wonderful organisation. And I also, in my bones, thought, they do need to change, you know, they do need a change. But I just thought, well, you know, they'll never appoint me. They're bound to appoint some, I thought at the time they were going to go for some businessman. You know, charities do this every now and again. They think, oh, we need a bit of structure around here. We need someone who knows what they're doing. And I was absolutely convinced, and there was a lot of gossip around, that that's what they do. But I applied for the job, and no one was more surprised than me, actually, that I got it. And it was just the most amazing combination of exhilaration and complete fear, I'll be honest with you, because I thought, goodness me, you know, this is a responsibility to beat all responsibilities. And it was, you know, with enormous trepidation that I stepped out of the civil service, where I had become, actually, I don't know as happy is quite the right word, but actually I enjoyed it. I felt I'd sort of established myself and had lots of good networks. And I miss those networks, actually. I have to say that's one of the things I miss most since leaving. But I stepped out of the civil service into this very big establishment organisation. But actually what was also very clear was when I arrived is that the organisation was not only wanted change, but they were massively up for change. And there was a real sense of frustration among many of the staff that things had become, you know, quite very bureaucratic, very slow, very cumbersome, actually very conservative. And I think there was just a feeling that they needed something different. So however deliberate it was, I mean, they could hardly have chosen anyone more different than me. Because, first of all, I was female, and there just hadn't been. I mean, there were hardly any senior women in the management structure of the Trust at that time, let alone Director General. I was much, much younger. I was 42 and I actually started much, much younger than anyone else who had been remotely anywhere near that job before. And my predecessor, who was the absolutely most lovely man, had retired in the job, and his predecessor had retired in the job, and his predecessor had retired in the job, and there'd been this tradition of very grand men. And what was the other thing was, I have to say this, but people were looking me up in Debrett's and Burke's and saying, well, we don't find a Reynolds anywhere. And it was perfectly true. I'm a product, a grammar school girl, with no grand family background whatsoever. And they just actually did take a while to get their heads around that everyone in the trust sort of really, in senior circles, expected you to be at least connected with some grand family. And it was a bit of a shock to discover that there I wasn't. The other thing in the National Trust, which some of you will understand if you're members, is that there are two very, very strong traditions in the National Trust. One, which is the James Lees Milne tradition, if you like. Ever heard of James Lees Milne, the diarist, who used to ride around the country in his Austin 7, going up to the sort of grand houses, and all of them facing penury and complete sort of agonizing, uncertain future, and try and persuade them to give their houses to the National Trust in the sort of 30s and 40s. And that's the aesthetic tradition, the aesthetes, what you might call the lilies. And they were a very sort of long and honourable tradition of these aesthetes. And that was a very strong tradition in the Trust. And my two predecessors had both been aesthetes, by which I mean curators, art historians or architectural historians, extremely knowledgeable about the architecture of our country. And the other tradition is the welly boot, which is the land agent, equally long and honourable, equally important, somebody who completely understands how estates are run and farming is carried out, and real kind of boots on the floor, good knowledge about the countryside. Now, I am a welly boot because I read land economy at Cambridge, so I did my qualifications to become a land agent, etc., etc. But I don't look like one, and that too is a bit of a problem because actually the aesthetes knew perfectly well that I wasn't an aesthete, and I wasn't, I had no qualifications or credibility in that side of the house. But the welly boots kind of just thought, well, maybe, but I hadn't actually got mud on my boots, and I didn't quite look the part. I certainly hadn't got my tweed jackets and my brogues and all the rest of it. So I just, some of that was quite interesting. And I don't know how conscious they were of looking for somebody completely different, because nobody ever quite tells you. But I was appointed, I was in post. And actually the very first thing, just as a complete aside, was that 6 weeks after I started, foot and mouth hit the country. And that was interesting because, as you can imagine, the first outbreak of foot and mouth in 2001 had a massive impact on the whole of the rural agenda. But I'll leave that story for another time. What I was going to talk about was the organisational changes. But partly because I did know the Trust a bit, I did know that my very, very, very first job was to work out what I wasn't going to change. Because I was literally going around the country meeting all the staff. They were grabbing me by the lapels and they were saying, Fiona, you've got to change this organisation. You've got to change. I mean, people were really desperate. They just felt this big change needed to happen, but couldn't really articulate what needed to change. So there was this sense of just there was going to be big change. So what not to change was really important. And I was very, very clear right from the outset that there were things that I wasn't going to change. First of all, I was not going to change our purpose in any way, shape or form. The Trust is one of these amazing organisations established by Act of Parliament, actually established 1895, but the Act of Parliament is 1907. And the words in the Act of Parliament, written by Robert Hunter, who was an MP and one of the founders, along with Octavia Hill, the housing campaigner, and Canon Hardwick Rawnsley, the Lake District cleric, who with Wordsworth had tried to stop the invasion of the Lake District with modern contraptions like railways and all the rest of it back in the 19th century. But the words in the Act, which were absolutely fantastic, were to promote the permanent preservation for the benefit of the nation of lands and buildings of historic interest or natural beauty. Now, I think those words are great, and I think they're great in the 21st century just as they were great 100 and something years ago. So I knew I wasn't going to change that. I wasn't going to fiddle about with the name or the logo or any of that stuff. The purpose is enduring. And nor was I going to change, and I really hope I've managed to achieve this, the passion of our staff because the one thing I felt absolutely inspired by the moment I walked through that door was the passion of our staff. We have 5,000 staff, 55,000 volunteers. So it's an enormous organisation. I know many of you work in huge ones too, but for a charity that is seriously big, and a turnover now of nearly 400 million. So, you know, this is a serious business organisation. But the passion is what gets people out of bed in the morning and what makes them go to sleep at night thinking they're doing a good job. And you cannot jeopardise that passion, nor that sort of loyalty and love of the organisation. And I'm a very warm person, and I decided straight away that I was going to talk about love and loyalty and passion and commitment. I wasn't going to come in. I'm not a suit. I'm not a person who can pretend to be something I'm not. So I came in and immediately started talking to people about how much I love the Trust, and actually that sort of sense of keeping that dialogue going at that level was really important to what then was some very, very testing times. Because when I looked at what needed to be changed, there was an awful lot. And it was everything from structures. Now, all of you go through structural change every 5 minutes. I mean, you're used to it, you know, constant reorganisation of the... And I saw a lot of it in Whitehall. And actually, you know, having seen a lot of it, new departments being formed, departments being merged, you know, units being formed, you know, all of that, you do it without blinking. But the National Trust just hadn't done it for 30 years, if not longer. And it had just grown like Topsy because they'd been incredibly successful. But actually, all kinds of odd bits were reporting to odd places. And there were huge inconsistencies in the way that even central services, which you might think were obvious, like HR and finance, were carried out. So we needed a big structural review. And those are horrible. And I knew in the Trust it would even be even more horrible, and it was. But I also, you know, needed the Trust to be more business-like. And this was where some people are cynical about the civil service, and I have my cynicisms about my time in the civil service, but I'm not cynical about civil servants, because I must say, the thing that astonished me and surprisingly kind of I enjoyed was the administration of the civil service. You know, that you're all brilliantly organised. If you produce a brief, and you sometimes have to do it in, you know, 3 hours or less, I'm sure, lots of you, you know where to go to make sure that information is properly based, that you've captured all the strands, that you've organised the material, that the files are well organised, the information's accessible, you've got great networks. And I must say, I really felt that the Trust could learn a thing or two from that very, very well-oiled machine that is the civil service working at its best. And it was really hard to sort of say, you know, I went in, and, I mean, this is a different example, but I went in and I said, well, can you tell me, you know, I went in November, our financial year runs to February. I said, come on, what are the monthly figures like? And they said, oh, we don't give you figures till the year end. And I was completely bowled over. This is a huge organisation that ran, and it wasn't unsuccessful. It's really important to understand that, but it ran on the sort of prudence and careful personal accountability of individuals. So everybody knew they had to be careful with money, and the budgets were like last year's, so more or less you did what you did last year, and you'd be all right. And then at the end of the year, added it all up, and lo and behold, you know, you'd probably done sort of okay. But there was no tracking, there was no monitoring, there was no sort of performance management of the kind that's become very familiar here. And more than that, you know, everybody just sort of did their job and didn't particularly have objectives and didn't particularly, I mean, it all was fine at one level, but there was no way that you could say, right, this is where we're going, we're going to do something new, we're going to do something different, unless you completely separately resourced it with different people. It was a very interesting organisation, built on tradition, built on this is how we do things. So that sense of being more business-like without becoming overly businessy was another challenge. There was also been a 20-year debate about location of offices. Now, this is sort of deadly dull to anyone outside, but I tell you, it was very lively. And I do remember standing up in our very glamorous offices in Queen Anne's Gate and saying to everybody, you know what, we're going to go to Swindon. And there was this sort of incredible sort of, first of all, silence, and then, oh, no, we're not. And I realised that it had been seen off at least twice before. There had been attempts to relocate, and the last one had been Bath. Now, if Bath could be seen off, Swindon, my goodness, Swindon could. And actually, I sort of took that as a personal challenge because we had 5 separate offices, all in different locations. Finance one place, marketing somewhere else, fundraising somewhere else, conservation somewhere else. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't even know each other. And actually, it just was absolutely inefficient in every way. So we did. We said, we are going to move everybody to Swindon. And, you know, if you don't want to come, this is a really hard thing to say, but, you know, you won't come. And anyway, but it was incredibly unpopular, so I just sort of register that. I also knew the Trust had to be more externally facing because it was an organisation that had marvellous internal sort of networks and people who'd worked there for 30 years who knew what was going on. But actually, to the outside world, it was pretty impenetrable. And I was frequently being rung up by people I knew in Parliament, in the civil service, saying, what does the Trust think about this? And there just wasn't an answer. Because what the Trust thought about it, well, you could ask Joe Bloggs what Joe Bloggs thought about it, or you could ask this region or this property what they thought about it, but actually it just didn't, there was no kind of coherent message coming to the outside world. So I knew that we had to be more externally facing and more connected with the outside world. And then finally, there was a governance challenge, because when I arrived at the Trust, there were 52 trustees. And that's not quite like having 52 ministers, but it's not far off it. And I don't know, any of you who know anything about charity governance must know that 52 trustees is just impossible. And of course, what happens when you've got 52 trustees is that all 52 want to make sure that in any strategy or any document or anything you say, basically, everyone wants their pennyworth in that document. So you can't publish a strategy that doesn't mention every single area of expertise the Trust has, or every part of the country, or whatever. So it just means everything becomes something for everybody, and without a clear and coherent sense of direction. So although that sounds very cruel in many ways, of an organisation that had been incredibly successful, actually, to me, these were very fundamental changes needed, because I knew that that sort of gentlemanly, this is how we do things, you know, so long as we keep on recruiting members, we can grow, we can take on more properties, and the properties, of course, are absolutely what make the Trust shine. So long as that was going on, people didn't see the need for change, but I knew that, you know, there were threats coming up to membership growth and everything else, and unless we became a better honed machine, unless we became kind of better organised, better structured, have a clearer direction, it would come and hit us, you know, one day. It was just a matter of time. So it was quite difficult to find the burning platform, in a sense, because it wasn't that membership was collapsing or anything like that. It was more that it would if we didn't do something about it. And those of you who've managed change will know that sort of issue around the burning platform is an enormous challenge. And you can threaten, and unless people understand and engage with the threat, that getting that buy-in, it can be difficult. So, anyway, we set on that track, and I think my determination grew rather than diminished as time went on to see these changes through, because there were so many points along the way when you could have said, you know what, let's not go to Swindon, let's just stay, you know, in our cosy offices, or let's, you know, we're making huge changes. At one point, nearly half the Trust had to stand back from their jobs, didn't have a job, and had to reapply for new jobs and new role profiles. And there were huge consultations, huge debates, enormously difficult and enormously stressful for those individuals. The only people who were not affected at that time were the property staff, because we knew that they had to carry on keeping the show on the road and keeping you know, the members and the visitors happy. But really, everybody else went through a very miserable time. Now, again, you know, many organisations would just say, well, that's what it's like, that's what happens. And I don't want to overstate it, but for the Trust, this was new. And these are people, many of them had given enormous long service and found it very traumatic. But we did go through our organisational review. We did restructure the whole organisation. We did make some tough decisions, and we lost some people, but we also, you know, got a very good structure, which is working well now. We did reorganise our regions. We had lovely, quaint regions like Mercia, which was very nice, but no one had a clue where it was. And actually, it just meant that external bodies like RDAs or even local authorities would struggle, you know, to work out who they were talking to. So we reorganised ourselves around other bodies. We did move to Swindon, and I never will regret that day, because we built a fantastic new green office, which is completely, it won prizes for the most sustainable office in the country. It's naturally lit. It's beautifully designed. It's in the Brunel Railway Yards, which actually is the only place in Swindon that the National Trust could ever have thought of going, because it is actually rather wonderful, the Great Western Railway Yards. It's like a big engine shed with photovoltaic roofs and lots of natural light. And it's a great place to work, and everyone came together, and the internal communication and all the rest of it has been completely transformed by that. We also reformed our governance, went from 52 trustees to 12, and it's just been liberating. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But above all, we also overhauled our finances. I mean, I mentioned this, the lack of financial information, lack of performance management. And we set ourselves some very, very challenging financial targets to generate what we call a 20% net gain every year in the trust, which means that for every 80p that we spend, we have to actually raise £1. Now that's unusual in charities. Most charities worry about breaking even, that's their target. And, you know, never mind making a sort of a surplus. And of course in the trust nothing's a surplus because you immediately need to spend it on so many properties that need new roofs or need investment or whatever. But actually that financial discipline, that process of going through, established, first of all, a completely different approach to running our finances, and everyone is much, much more financially aware now, which was critical when you think of the credit crunch and the experience we're now going through. But also, it just brought a sort of sense of discipline and accountability into the organisation. But it was very difficult, and I have to say there was a period when you could hardly open Private Eye, and there was that Blair Babe, you know, that was from my days at the civil service, even though civil servants, as we all know, are not political appointments. Blair Babe destroying National Trust. You know, the move to Swindon got acres of negative publicity. You know, I felt very lonely, I have to say, for quite a long time. Because all these 52 trustees, who were all still there, just went, oh, well, of course, it wasn't me that said we should go to Swindon, or it wasn't me who said we should change the conservation department or centralise HR, or, you know, all these big changes we were doing. And I very much felt, you know, like this sort of dangling, you know, let Fiona, she's leading this change, let Fiona kind of stand up for herself. And, you know, managing change like that can be very, very hard. And lots of tut-tutting from, you know, even my lovely predecessors were going, well, you know, this is all a bit, you know, what are we losing in this process? And I have to say, so for 5 years, it was pretty damn tough. And I must say, there were times when I thought, gosh, if I didn't adore this organisation, if I wasn't passionate about the cause, I would be finding this, you know, extremely stressful. But it was absolutely amazing that the big moment when suddenly it all came together. I remember walking into the Swindon office on about, actually, it was 2005. Yeah, 2005, so 4 years ago, and about July the 3rd, so just over a year ago. And I remember having a sleepless night the night before and thinking, you know what, if this office doesn't work for people, you know, this could be it. This could be curtains for Fiona. And I remember walking into the office from the station that morning and just arriving and hearing other people arrive, and everyone was going, wow, because it is a beautiful office. It's not like any other office. It's huge high ceilings, a huge lovely atrium, all wood from the National Trust estate, beautiful tapestries, contemporary tapestries, and beautiful colours everywhere. Now, the National Trust does do aesthetics very well, so even our filing cabinets are a very beautiful shade of green. And actually, it matters, and it just did not look like any old office. And people did, and that moment, that wow moment that people said, from then I knew that was going to be all right. And then the next thing that happened in September 2005 was our new trustees were appointed. And there are 12 trustees, and they are brilliant people. And from that moment on, the shift of 52 trustees sort of not really taking responsibility for everything to 12 who really engage, who can really argue, really work together, just was transformational. And from that moment on, I knew that I could then do the things that I had come to the Trust to do. And they weren't to reorganise or to make us financially better, in better shape and all the rest of it. They were to make the National Trust the organisation that our founders would be proud to see. And I went straight back to the things that I wrote at my interview and talked about at my interview about the National Trust, fulfilling our purpose to the nation in real 21st century terms. And that was the strategy that I was only able to write when these reforms had finally come into place. And that's really what has been going on since. And so it's not that there is now no change at the Trust. In fact, on the contrary, there is masses of change going on at the Trust. It's just not that sort of structural, reorganisational change in quite the same way. It's much more, it's about culture change, behaviour change. And it now is really beginning to come to life. And I think what's amazing is you can see how the foundations we laid in the early years are beginning to bear fruit. I mean, the results do speak for themselves in many ways. I mean, membership growth, which was 2.8 million when I arrived, and sort of languishing in many ways, is now 3.7 million in 8 years. And that is, I'm absolutely so proud of that. Our financial effectiveness, we hit that 20% net gain target. Even last year in the credit crunch, we hit 19.8% net gain. So we've just, people are able to adapt and respond. And this year, we're having a phenomenal year. There's a sort of can-do anything feel now, which I must say, one of my very early things, again, along with foot and mouth, that sort of are not things I planned, but came and we took the opportunity, was the acquisition of Tintsfield, which is the Victorian Gothic mansion outside Bristol, which we had this enormous public appeal to save in 2002. And everybody had said, this woman, not only is she not an aesthete, but she's clearly not going to acquire a country house ever again. And there, the very first thing I did was acquire a country house. But in a different way, acquiring it not to sort of go away and burnish and polish and then unveil to an adoring public, but right from day one, people coming in, seeing it in all its state of neglect, actually engaging with it, helping us with conservation. Young kids from Bristol, unemployed kids, kids who'd been on drug rehab schemes, coming and doing the slash and burn of the undergrowth and building big bonfires and helping us clear the ground. So for the first time, this idea of participative conservation was born. And that was the real seed of my sense. That's what the Trust needs to be, and needs to be now. And so that real sense of buy-in to a change, which is where basically my ambition for the Trust and what is now happening is the Trust needs to be in love with people. And that may sound a really strange thing to say, but to be honest, it's the absolute core of it, because for a long, long, long time, the Trust was in love with places, in love with architecture, in love with the arts, in love with beautiful countryside. And if you think about, you know, the big things the Trust has done, everything from the country houses scheme to Neptune for the coastline to big open spaces right down to the Beatles house, you know, the focus was all on places. And I went back and started rereading the biographies of Octavia Hill, the sort of stories of the early part. And I thought, you know what, they didn't establish this organisation for places, or at least not for places alone. It was for people. And it was those words, for the benefit of the nation, that really made me feel that that is the mission that we still need to re-energise and revivify. And that's because, at the end of the day, and this is how our new strategy, which was written in 2005, is now playing out. You know, we live in such a different world, even from the world of James Lee's Mill and people running around the countryside in the 30s, but profoundly different. And the big difference is that, you know, people nowadays just don't have that sort of sense of being told what to do. And I'm sure any of you who work, you know, with a benefit system or a health system or anything else, you know, people are much more critical, much more challenging, much more sort of independent, if you like. And they're not going to join a national trust because it presents beautiful properties to them and goes, ta-da, you know, here, how clever we are. People want to feel that they're involved, engaged, that their views count, that we're actually interested in them and what makes them tick. And so we've been going through this now enormous cultural change in the organisation, giving a sense of our properties being there not only to conserve and protect beautiful architecture, beautiful landscapes, beautiful gardens, you know, all of that is done, but it's done for and with people. And that has been a culture change, because we had what I used to describe when I first came as a sort of slightly arms-closed approach, to conservation, where, you know, the National Trust has bought it or has been given it, we put our arms around it, we're looking after it, it's safe, you know, and then, oh, you feel very lucky, you can come and see it. And I think what we're trying to do now is say all of this conservation is for the nation. It's for our members and supporters for sure, but it's also strategically important for the nation. And that takes us into arguments around climate change and the role of our estate. We are a bigger landowner than any other organisation other than the MOD and the Forestry Commission. And our upland estate in particular is holding carbon for the nation. It's storing water for the nation. It's also, we're holding much of the nation's treasures, whether it's architecturally or art or, again, the beautiful coastline and beautiful views. And I think we can show, and we're in a position to show, how our lives are not only enriched by this, it's not only a nice to have. Increasingly, it's clear that it's absolutely essential for the quality of life of this nation that we do look after these fundamental resources. I don't know if any of you heard the Prince of Wales last night, the Dimbleby lectures, but I mean, so much of what he was saying was resonant with what the National Trust, we are seeing so many indicators, whether it's species decline, whether it's the loss of huge habitats, whether it's climate change, coastline erosion, massive change going on. And we're in a position now to, I think, demonstrate the value to the nation of looking after these places forever, for everyone. And as a result of that, and I think the big change that all these changes have brought about is that the Trust has become more ambitious to play the kind of role that I think Octavia Hill was talking about when back in the 1890s she was on Speaker's Corner and up in the Lake District, talking about the nation facing disaster. At that point, it was the empire and the kind of industrialization, and she and her fellow founders were saying, of course there's good in this, but there's also terrible bad in it, and it was children being exploited down the mines and living in terrible poverty and terrible deprivation in ghastly sort of slums in inner cities. Now, today's version of that, I think, is climate change and is the sense of whether we're going to survive as a species on this planet. And it's not, I think, too grand or too overblown to say the National Trust has a really important role there. But I think what that's done, that sense of opportunity, that sense of ambition, has given our staff a much clearer sense of direction. So no longer do people sit there saying, well, we've always done it like this, so this is how we're going to carry on doing it. We've got people looking at the impacts of climate change, how we can adapt our management practices, how we can put our own house in order by reducing our carbon footprint, how at our properties we can engage people in seeing and understanding the contribution that they as individuals can make, but also how they, through participating in conservation, they can get close to things that matter to them and to a higher quality of life. And I think we have become, as a result, not as far as we'd like to be, but less bureaucratic, more risk-taking, and more out for opportunities. And so my final point really is, in a sense, how, as we've gone into the credit crunch, which of course all of you will be thinking about the impacts of public expenditure cuts and major changes coming, how the National Trust has sort of find itself in this position. And I think in many, many ways, although it was a very alarming period last year as it started to bite and our income started to fall and people just stopped spending money in properties, and actually for a long time visitor numbers were down as well. But as the years turned, and as we've come into 2009, some very, very interesting things have been going on. And the most important thing is, I think that people are starting to question some of the kind of emphasis we've had on materialism and instant gratification and the sort of, just the me society that perhaps, for 20 or 30 years has become increasingly prevalent. And we've seen real evidence of people seeking out what I would call, the simple pleasures of life. Time spent driving to the shopping centre with your kids arguing in the back about which new gizmo they want is not a happy family life, but going out and having a picnic in beautiful countryside or visiting a beautiful place. Actually, more and more people seem to want to catch these special moments and almost create memories for the future. And so we've seen this upsurge in interest in, a quality of life agenda, which we've been tapping into with increasing confidence. And our big allotments campaign that some of you may have seen this spring, where we're saying to our properties, come and have an allotment at National Trust properties, whether it's in a kitchen garden or a bit of a field or whatever, has had an overwhelming response. I've just come back from Northern Ireland, where it's just gone mad over there. Everybody wants an allotment. And for the National Trust to be providing it rather than local authorities somehow seems true to our spirit and our founders. and people find it really engaging. And actually, there are sort of 4-year waiting lists in the nearby towns, and you can come out and get going at a National Trust property. So that sense of a lively, people-focused, passionate organisation, but one that is now also increasingly connected to the big policy debates and challenges that we as a society face. Of course, we've got a long way to go, and of course, you know, there are many, many challenges still. But I must say, for me, it's been a kind of inspiring journey. It's sometimes quite a terrifying journey, sometimes quite a lonely journey, and one that I know will never end. I think the big message is that to be successful and to thrive, any organisation actually has to keep on changing and emphasise as much cultural change as structural change. But it's one that I'm incredibly proud to be part of, and incredibly proud. I just hope that our founders, if they were sitting there, particularly Octavia Hill, I just always feel that sort of sense of the woman in those early days. I hope they'd be proud at what they see. I'm sure they'd say, come on, ever more, but I hope they'd be proud at what they see today. So that's what I was going to talk to you about. I'd love to know whether you've got any questions. Any of you members might say, oh, that sounds very good, but I don't see much of it on the ground. I'd love to know what you really think. And also whether you think there are any resonances with the civil service and some of the challenges that you're facing in your roles. So, over to you. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, so a question about volunteers, and you're absolutely right. I mean, in the Trust, we really see volunteers absolutely as part of the team. You know, they're not separate, and in terms of the kinds of internal comms and, you know, all the rest of it, that they are central. One of the big things we've done in our strategy is set much simpler goals than we used to. And the one we're running with at the moment, which is very relevant to what I've just been talking about, is to try and get the feedback from people at properties to 75% of people to say they have a very enjoyable time. Now, in the past, we did get very high rates for having an enjoyable time. So, you know, it was sort of 80, 90%, but much smaller numbers saying very enjoyable. And so that's been the trigger to get volunteers on board, because we said to them, you know, you volunteers who often see themselves as, you know, a bit like this, and some of you will have had experience of going into houses, and there's sort of a don't touch atmosphere, and, you know, this is all very precious, and, you know, children mustn't run around and all the rest of it. And we've said that's just got to change. It's got to change. And volunteers, we're giving them lots of training to become what we're calling, not sort of room stewards, which was that rather sort of defensive, but room guides, and their whole role is to try and help people enjoy it. And also, and this is happening slowly, but I hope you'll start to see it, you know, lots more places where people can sit down, can sit on the chairs, you know, can pick up a book and read, because it's so oppressive sometimes, that sort of feeling of, it's all so precious, I can't touch it. But the volunteers are definitely one of our biggest cultural challenges. But when they get it, they really get it. And they're passionate about the places. And for me, what I often say is it's about just sharing their passion with other people, not sharing their passion with their own fellow volunteers, but with the people who come in. And that simple KPI, I mean, just as a management tool, it's been one of the most effective. The 20% net gain was really effective in driving efficiency, effectiveness, and everything through the system. And now this 75% visitor enjoyment figure is having a similar, completely transformational effect, particularly with volunteers. And other questions? Yeah. Funding, mostly membership actually. I mean, the income now is about nearly 400 million, and about 120 million is from membership, which is amazing. But another 80 is from combined legacies and fundraising, direct fundraising. So that takes us up to over 200, which is, you know, an amazingly sort of significant proportion when you compare it with lots of other charities. The rest of it comes from things like rents, I mean, agricultural rents, cottage rents. We've got something like 30,000 cottages. I mean, the statistics I always feel they sound very, but you know, 250,000 hectares of land, 170 miles of coastline, about 50,000 vernacular buildings, of which about 30,000 are let, 300 mansion properties, 250 gardens, you know. And by the time you've got, you know, visitor income for the properties, rents, trading income from the shops and restaurants, and grants, including single farm payment from DEFRA, for which thank you very much. But also we do get grants for specific projects. HLF particularly help us with some of the big projects, but also lots of local authorities, quite a lot of corporate support for example, we've got a fantastic sponsorship arrangement with the Yorkshire Bank at the moment to do a lot of greening our gardens, lots of water butts and getting off oil for garden maintenance. So, when you add all that together, that adds the rest in. But it's a very high percentage. And my great joy, I have to say, is that we're not dependent on anyone but ourselves. It's lovely to get all these grants, but we're not dependent on them. We are a proud, free charity, and that makes an enormous difference in terms of our sort of sense of purpose and ambition. Yeah.
Hello. What about your relations with English heritage? I'm thinking particularly in relation to the long-running sagas over what you do with Stonehenge.
Well, Stonehenge is a special case which I'll come back to, which has been rumbling for 30 years, and it's finally got to a happier place. English Heritage are our regulator and our competitor, if I'm honest. I think competition is a very good thing, because I always feel that, there's not one way to look after our heritage, and so the private sector, many houses still in private ownership, many gardens in private ownership, and English Heritage being there is a strength. But they are also our regulator, because they give us consent or not for changes to listed buildings and a lot of obviously the management work that we do. And we have a healthy relationship with them. I think there's a certain amount of, honestly, a certain amount of tension, which is not surprising. We kind of want to outsmart them, and they want to outsmart us. On Stonehenge, there's been 30 years of arguing, as you probably know all very well, but because it's very, very difficult. We own all the land around Stonehenge, but the government, and English Heritage looks after it for the government, own the tiny little triangle within which the henge sits. But of course, Stonehenge is not just the stones, it is a historic landscape, and so in many ways the stuff outside is as important in archaeological terms as the stones. But we've been trying to get a site for a new visitor centre for the past 30 years, and we finally agreed one, which is very good news, just outside the World Heritage Site, thank the Lord, because that would have been tricky if we hadn't gone outside, and it's starting to happen. So, but sometimes these things do take far too long, and that's one of them. Yeah.
Can I ask you about staff engagement?
Yes. Staff engagement, yeah.
In terms of your reward and recognition, especially in terms of your volunteers, I know that you said they're passionate and they come along and they do their job, but in what way do you actually retain the volunteer, that passion aside?
Yes, well, just quickly on volunteers, they are volunteers. It's an absolute cardinal rule. They must be volunteers, and that's sort of charity law. You have to be very clear. But we can pay expenses, and so we pay mileage rates typically, and that's critical to a large number. Many of them retired people on very small pensions and probably, at the moment, increasingly worried. But a lot of them come, I would say, a day a week or something like that, and so they may be doing other things, but they do get their mileage. But retention is entirely, in their case, about feeling valued. It's really simple. If we don't look after them, if we don't show we care, if we don't involve them, they don't come back. So that's really clear. On the staff side, we get incredibly high, we do staff surveys like I'm sure all of you do, we get incredibly high loyalty. Sort of over 90%. I mean, we've benchmarked against, other companies, and we're right up there with the very, very top corporate sector, up with people like Waitrose and John Lewis, and, very, very high levels of commitment. But when you go beneath the surface and you say, well, what are you frustrated about? There's still quite a lot that comes out, still bureaucracy, still, takes time to get decisions made, etc. So we listen to that very carefully, and that a lot of our strategy is about freeing up internally. Remuneration, we benchmark ourselves against lower quartile public sector. So we don't pay well, and we can't afford to pay well. and it's a real issue. But what we do is make a big commitment that we will keep at that point so people don't slip behind. And one of the big things with improving our financial performance in the last 7 or 8 years is we have invested hugely in staff salaries. We're still only at that benchmark, but we were slipping way behind it. And we do have gardeners and staff wardens at properties who earn very, very little. But each year they can see. So even this last year, when lots of people were saying pay freezes, and I know there's lots of debate about that at the moment, we actually had a pay envelope of 3%, which we felt was really important to keep that. So we don't pay well, we'll never pay well, but we do try and keep up with our point in the market.
When you say that you staff feel valued,
Yes.
what do you do? Pay aside to create that feeling of worth?
Well, I think that's a really, really good question. I think, to me, it's about, they need to feel two things. They need to feel personally committed to the National Trust and to their job and their place. And there is a sort of sense of, they are lovely places to work, particularly properties. And people who are inspired and are passionate about conservation or art and architecture. I mean, these are plum jobs. So there's a bit of it that, even if you're an administrator in a not very well-paid job at a glorious place, where I was at Florence Court in Fermanagh yesterday, and I met people whose eyes just shine and say, I can't imagine working anywhere better, and with lovely people. So there is just that sort of emotional bond. But I think the other thing is, and this is what the changes have brought about and things have improved, is they want to feel proud of the organisation and where it's going. And I think when 1,000 Flower bloomed, and it was all very much down to Joe Bloggs here or Jane Smith there or whatever, I think the frustration was pitching, that love for the organisation. What I get now, what we get from the staff surveys now is, do you think the trust is going in the right direction? And how do you feel about your part in that? And those are the figures that have really gone up. And people starting to feel, yes, there's a cause here that's bigger than my immediate workplace and my immediate colleagues. And that's the thing that is my job, I think, to give people that sense of direction and purpose and meaning, for the organisation, because it was founded on a big promise. And, we're not just here sort of pottering about. We've got a big promise to the nation, which people are proud to feel part of. Yeah.
At a time when other charities, similar charities, say like the RHS, are maybe struggling to retain members, what do you feel it is that National Trust is doing differently to keep hold of yours?
Well, we ask ourselves that question a million times a minute, as you can imagine, because it's so critical to us. I mean, if our membership really did start to decline, I think it would be very serious. I think there's two things. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that, even in these sort of, difficult economic times, that we do offer phenomenal value for money. And we work very hard to keep that. So there is an unashamed commercial sort of calculation that goes on. Those of you who are members, I don't know, if you're aware of, membership, but it's £82 at the moment for a family to join. For that, you get free access to 300 pay-for-entry properties through England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and untold, coast and countryside, and a feel-good, I hope, in your heart as well. And actually, I always say to people, I can't take my kids out to Pizza Express for £82, for one meal. And so we really do say this is phenomenal value for money. You only have to visit twice or at most 3 times to get your money back. And with people holidaying at home this year, even more than in previous years, we're seeing people, make that value for money calculation. And, other organisations, other charities don't have that as strongly. We are everywhere. Every single part of the country has a National Trust property about 20 minutes away. I mean, we just have enormous reach and spread. The other thing, which is the bit that we've been working so hard on when I was talking about this becoming a people-focused organisation, is really trying to give people that kind of warm glow. And we've set ourselves, some very ambitious, what we call perception-shifting ambitions, which is to encourage people, and we do lots of market research. I'm sure, you're all very familiar with this, where you say to people, what do you feel about when you hear the National Trust? And what used to come back was very good, very worthy, very clever, very skilled, a good thing, but not very friendly, not very family friendly, not very interested in me, and a bit aloof. And so we've been bashing away at all of those things. And the members already, that's shifting, which is really, really exciting. It takes a long time to shift perceptions, as I'm sure you know. But people are starting to say, and that the phrase we use internally is the National Trust is a good thing, but not my thing. And when we get people coming back saying it's a good thing and it's my thing, then I think, you know, that deeper emotional bond will be there. And that's shifting. And in terms of sign up, it's the value for money, but in terms of staying members and retention, it's that warmth, that sense of people focus. So massive, massive investment in family friendliness and you know, all of that going on to try and make that happen. But it's critical to us, yeah. Yep, there's one at the back.
Hi, I'm a civil servant, but I'm currently on secondment to the Prince's Charities Office to lead an initiative called Charity Next, which seconds fast streamers into key posts in the third sector for up to a year. Partly it's really about trying to build better mutual understanding between the sectors and sort of encourage cross-sector working. And I just wondered whether you've got any thoughts on how sectors can work better together to sort of solve social problems.
Yes, I mean, it's really interesting because the Prince's Trust is really good at this. And in fact, we've got a fantastic project with the Prince's Trust at the moment about youth engagement and getting young people, particularly, the Prince's Trust is very focused, who are NEET, you know, not in education, employment or training, into a whole range of jobs within the National Trust, you know, everything from admin to scrub bashing to, you know, lots of sort of help, practical help at properties. And it's been very interesting that